posse in the corner says, "Get closer to the mic." Carolyn and I were married in 1968, and we settled into this small town in southern Georgia, not too far from Jimmy Carter's Plains. It was close to the air base where I was completing my tour of duty. Carolyn had been hired as a county home economist and had an office in the county building. Early on, an African-American man wandered in, asked to use the men's room. Carolyn directed him down the hall. Soon afterward, her boss came fuming into her office and directed her to never allow a Negro to use the white indoor bathrooms. Their facilities, little more than an outhouse, was outside around back. This was 4 years after the Civil Rights Act had been passed. And soon after I finished my tour of duty in the Air Force, I was finishing my degree in education at a local college and was sent to another small town for a student teaching at the high school. I reported early on a Monday morning to a decrepit facility badly in need of paint, and I suspected just about everything else. I felt unusual that all the faces that stared at me were black. And the folks at the front desk informed me that I was at the wrong high school. I should go across town to the other school. I thought this town is so small, how could it possibly need 2 high schools? When I got there, those folks informed me with demeaning smiles that I had gone to the traditional black school, whereas I was assigned the white and sparkling school, of course. As an ignorant Yankee, I explained that since the Supreme Court's Brown versus the Board of Education 14 years before that, there were no segregated schools any longer. Oh, it was explained to me that we are not segregated. Any student who wants to move from the black school to the white was free to do so, and vice versa. Of course, no white student went to the black school, and only the bravest black families dared send their children over to the white school. I discovered how ingrained and clever segregation can be. Casey wants to tell you about her reflections on her trip and the civil rights movement.
I've been an active member of this congregation for many years. This past July, you gave me the opportunity to go on a civil rights journey. Being at the ripe age of 17, I knew this is a great way to expand my knowledge of the world. Along with Ryan and Deanna, I was able to take this amazing ride. Going into this, I thought I knew most everything I needed to know about the civil rights movement, but come to find out I really knew very little. What is taught in schools just grazes the surface of this deep subject. I mean, let's get real. I don't think an occasional Martin Luther King Jr. word search during Black History Month is really teaching me what I need to know about the civil rights movement. This journey helped mold my understanding of what actually went on during this period. We got to meet real live people that lived during this movement. One woman we met was Fred Gray's daughter. Fred Gray is a civil rights attorney and an activist who still practices law in Alabama today. He worked with Martin Luther King Jr., E.D. Nixon, Rosa Parks, and was involved in many cases during the movement. His daughter actually owned the Tuskegee Multicultural Center, and when we visited there, we were fortunate enough to meet and speak with her. Another woman we met was actually in our group. She was a white woman from the Bronx who was a freedom rider. When she was 16, she began her rides. She had many stories to share with us along our journey. I believe we are one of the last generations that will be able to have a conversation with these civil rights activists. It is intriguing to talk with such persons because they have all the vivid details that you'd never be able to hear about otherwise. I could hardly put the civil rights movement into realistic terms before this trip, but after being at all the different sites and seeing all the people and tombstones, it really started coming to life. I loved experiencing that part of the trip. Although I will never know exactly what life was like to be an African American in the South in the 50s and 60s, I have a much better understanding now, for I have walked in some of their paths. One of my favorite days was when we visited the Edmund Patterson Bridge in Selma, Alabama. This was the bridge that the Freedom Riders and civil rights activists walked across in their fight for justice. It was here that the peaceful protesters were met with police forces, and some were beaten down or sprayed with powerful hoses. We walked across the bridge, and it brought all kinds of emotions to the entire group. We walked in silence and individually reflected as we walked. One thing I noticed was the beautiful river that flowed beneath the bridge. Its peacefulness and serenity must have been reassuring for the people crossing the bridge in the face of violence to come. For all the ugly things in the world, there's always something beautiful. After crossing the bridge, some people in our group were so overwhelmed with the power it had emitted that they just cried. The people that we met and the bonds that we made along this journey are unforgettable. I really loved meeting so many different people. It was so cool to get to know everyone's backgrounds. There was one African American woman from the Bronx, Hope, who was a UU pastor there. She had participated in a few journeys through the South before this one, and she was one of our 3 leaders. The other 2 leaders were from Boston, Rowan and Sam. One girl was entering her freshman year in college from Phoenix, Arizona. A few of the other youth were from North Carolina, and everyone else was from Jersey or Philly. Although we came from all different parts of the country, we all came for one common interest, and that was social justice. Social justice was always important to me, but it has become an even more important part of my life after I went on this journey. The civil rights movement is one of the biggest parts of our American history and is also severely overlooked. So many people know so little about this movement that happened only about 50 years ago. After observing things in the South, it seems that much of the news that should have been broadcasted nationally just stayed local. This could be the core reason for lack of education on this specific subject. I believe schools need to have greater passion in teaching civil rights to students, and I am advocating for that passion. I couldn't stress to you all enough how important it is to get out and explore the world. There is so much more to life than your home, your town, and even your country. And I just want to thank you all for making this trip possible for us. Thank you.
In April of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and the country erupted with racial turmoil. During that same week, I was assigned yet another military burial detail for soldiers sent back from Vietnam. This one was in a poor black neighborhood of Jacksonville, Florida. The soldier was 19. Excuse me. Near the end of the burial, my job was to fold the flag, draping the coffin into a tight triangle, and present it to the next of kin, usually the mother. I handed it to her and delivered the prepared speech that ended with, "This is a symbol of a grateful nation." She looked at me with tears and disdain in her eyes and said in her soft voice, "Sergeant, this is not a grateful nation. Thank you anyway." Brian wants to tell you about his experiences at Tuskegee.
On my civil rights journey, I met great people, went to many remarkable places, and had an unforgettable time. To me, the monuments and museums were the most interesting part of the trip because you learned the most from them. We went to over 20 sites in Atlanta, Georgia, and Tuskegee, Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham, Alabama. So if I was to describe all of the places we went to, I'd be writing a book. So I will highlight my 2 favorites. One of those museums was the Tuskegee Airmen Museum. the Tuskegee Airmen were the first African-American Army Air Corps fighters. From a distance, we first saw the runways of an airport, then airplane hangars came into sight, and finally the airplanes. We pulled up the driveway and got the full view of the airfield. There was one long runway, 2 airplane hangars, and 2 buildings with no walls, just the inner framework. We learned that those skeletons were just markers of where 2 storehouses used to be before they burnt to the ground from combustible air fuel. After everyone was finished looking at these, we headed inside. Before the museum, we get a guide who tells us the history of the Tuskegee Airmen. He explained that at Army bases, German POWs had more privileges than the Tuskegee Airmen because of discrimination against African Americans. After his speech, we went inside the museum, which was inside one of the airplane hangars, to view all of the exhibits. On the edge of the hangar were the offices of the commanders of the airfield. These rooms were preserved in time. There are old Coke bottles, old fans, old telephones, typewriters, cigarettes, pretty much everything you picture when you think of the 40s. After I looked at the offices, I went to the main section of the hangar, which was where the planes were stored. 2 planes were in there, one of which flew the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. The Secret Service men were beside themselves, so they called the president asking what they should do, and he said, "Let her fly." When she got off the plane, she said, "These guys sure know how to fly." That played a big part in getting the airmen the rights they deserved. There were many exhibits which allowed you to listen to pilots, mechanics, and women who worked on the airfield. The other place I enjoyed most was also in Tuskegee. It is an old schoolhouse where African American kids had to go to school, and the school was miles from the main part of Tuskegee. When we got to the school, we had lunch at a fish fry next door. It was a good Southern meal. The schoolhouse looks like the typical one-room schoolhouse. The school was built back in 1903 and was used up until 1958. At that point, it was sold and made into a small sewing workshop. Later, the building was bought back by former students who wanted to educate people about Black history. One of those former students made a tour for us. The theme of the tour was From Slave Ships to Spaceships. The tour began with African memorabilia, then it continued showing how African Americans were forced into slavery. The tour went on showing the history and struggles of African Americans and ended with an exhibit on how African Americans have obtained the highest ranking jobs, such as astronauts. This trip was a life-changing experience, and I want to thank this congregation because it wouldn't have been possible without all of you.
First, I want to thank Bob Baum for inviting me to participate with this group. As part of our journaling class, we went to give examples of writing and keeping watch for what goes on. Even though I'm 85 years old and I've experienced a lot in the past, I'm no Clint Eastwood. I'm still looking at 10, 15, maybe 20 more years. So I too, as you can, ask, what can I achieve in these coming years? So I thought you might like to hear about segregation in my time. Frequently, we would go to the dog or horse races in Florida where I lived, And down at the far end was these bleacher seats. So I asked what they were, and that was where the blacks were segregated. They could only sit down in that area. But what bothers me the most is, what do we do about it? We say, oh, isn't that interesting? And we go on with our lives. Can you imagine traveling a long distance from New York, New Jersey, to Florida, and not being allowed to enter a restaurant? You had to stand at the back door, humbly hoping to be served. You could not use the restrooms at gas stations. That was the regular place that we stopped at that time. We didn't have Wawas then. You were forbidden to use public water fountains. Can you imagine being so hot and thirsty with water so close, but you're stopped by a sign that says, whites only? The slavery ended legally with the Civil War Emancipation Proclamation, though the opportunity of equal jobs did not still exist. Opportunity was labor, housework, demeaning work, and demeaning attitudes. They were still called names, not blacks or African American. Fortunately, I grew up in Pittsburgh, a melting pot city of the world, where I lived with all cultures and was accepting of all cultures and saw everyone as equal. What disturbs me most in retrospect is how accepting we were of the conditions at the time. All this took place in my lifetime, most of it not being aware of their plight in life. But you have the opportunity to make this a better world. Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Diana Terrazzini, who will give her view of the Freedom Right journey.
I'd like to first thank all of you who made it possible for the Sturts and I to go on this trip. It was an amazing experience, and I learned so much. Before this trip, I went to classes with Casey and Ryan to work on journaling, and while I was in Georgia and Alabama, I kept a journal, and today I'd like to share with you a few of my writings. Day 1. The Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Georgia. It was such a beautiful church. Long corridors lead to an open room with tiled floors, and the sanctuary had slanted stadium seats up high on the walls with the podium in the center. After our tour, we gathered in a room and we began a long 6 hours of deep learning. We learned about racism and oppression. We talked about our privileges and how we could use those privileges to help others in need. It was so spiritual and eye-opening as our speaker, George Friday, told us all about her experiences as a poor black woman, but how she brought herself up and how she now is a civil rights activist. She was so powerful and inspiring, and it opened up a lot of courage in myself. On day 2, we visited the Tuskegee National Historic Site and the Harris Barrett School, which Ryan has already described for us. Day 3, personally my favorite day of the trip, we visited the Rosa Parks Museum, Southern Poverty Law Center, the Dexter Church, and the Dr. King Family Parsonage. Today we visited the Rosa Parks Museum. It was extraordinary. We sat in a cold room on padded benches, some of us on the floor, as we watched a video about the segregated buses. An automatic black door takes us to a scene of a bus with images in the windows of black and white people, and there, in the front seat, is Rosa Parks. Bless you. A scene plays out of a white man with no seat and a bus driver demanding Rosa Parks give up her seat for the man. Of course, with an answer of no, she gets arrested, and the boycotting starts from there. After the Rosa Parks Museum, we went to the Southern Poverty Law Center. We have to go through a metal detector because of the major security reasons. A melted clock hanging on the wall as we enter is explained that it is the result of a KKK group bombing of the SPLC. In the Southern Poverty Law Center, a man takes us on a tour of the past of Alabama. Through a long hallway, we come to a dark room with names floating on a screen, and to the side written is Wall of Tolerance. On a computer screen, you can add your name to the wall if you pledge to fight against injustice and to work for equality and human rights. I immediately add my name, and it pops up on the big screen in green. After the wall, we headed to the Dexter Church, which was Dr. King's church. It was very beautiful inside with stained glass in the original pews and a table in the front that read, "In remembrance of me." Afterwards, we visited the parsonage where Dr. King and his family stayed. We walked through the same living room he used and the same dining room he held meetings in. In the kitchen, he spoke to us by radio about his vision and the night he received a threatening call. We also saw his kitchen table where he sat and thought about the safety of his family. Day 4. Driving on the highway, we turn around and pull to the side of the road. A grave sits there with the name Viola Liuzzo, a woman, one of the first, who lost her life for the civil rights movement. She was driving a black man home one night, and she was being chased by members of the KKK. She sped up to 100 miles per hour, singing at the top of her lungs freedom songs. They pull alongside her, and as she smiles at them, they shoot her, and she crashes on the highway. Her grave has to be fenced in because of all the hate and vandalism that was done to it. After the grave, we went to the National Voting Rights Museum. There were pictures of men and women who lost their lives for the right to vote. Just before the museum, our group walked over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which was the Selma to Montgomery Walk, or Bloody Sunday, where black folks were beaten and trampled by the state military. In the museum, the people who marched were called foot soldiers, and there were molds of the feet of the people who were involved in it. We saw the uniform of a Ku Klux Klansman member, and they had a replica of a jail cell that had pictures of different people who had been arrested. The purpose of the museum was to mention the locals and just people who were in the march and movement who were not acknowledged by the newspapers or the textbooks. Day 5. Today, we went to the 16th Street Baptist Church. Here, 4 girls were killed by a bombing that was set up by KKK men. We sat in the original pews and saw and heard the story of the bombing and of the creation of the original church. We saw the exact spot of the bomb and saw where they built back up and fixed the stained glass. Across the street from the church is the Birmingham Civil Rights Tour. There we went through a very long self-led tour. All around you saw the faces of the movement and had interactive voices telling you their story. At the beginning, there were examples of the segregation from water fountains to restaurants, barbershops, and schools. It was really cool, and a lot of it was from actual places in the civil rights movement. We learned that the African Americans built that town from coal mining to dangerous factory work. It was also educational and informative. We also went to the park across the street called the Kelly Ingram Park, where most of the dog enforcement and water hose use was at. Along the circled path of stone, there were sculptures of dogs with vicious teeth and people cowering away from hoses. It's crazy to think that where we stood, hundreds of people were beaten, bit, and hurt. It's scary and sickening to think that America was ever that way. Day 6. We finally arrive at the 16th Street Baptist Church, and we walk up red carpeted stairs to the main part of the church. Large stained glass windows grow above me as I walk down the aisle. The pulpit where Dr. King stood sits right in front of me, and I envision him speaking powerful words in front of me. The main thing I learned on this trip was about tolerance. As a teenager, you don't always think that having tolerance for something because it's different. On this trip, I met a lot of different teenagers, and this experience has brought us together and made us come together in spite of our differences. Thank you.